Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane, and you can see the shadow here, and it is a stunning morning. And if we take a look here at the sunrise, this is the sun just blasting over the horizon shortly after 8:30 a.m. on the morning of Friday the 8th of December 2017. It's certainly a crisp one this morning, and the temperature is, well, I think it's probably barely above freezing. In fact, it may not be above freezing yet. My hands are certainly feeling it. And it's a stunning morning, at least it's dry. Over the last few days, you know, we've been dealing with thaw, plus quite heavy rain at night. But it's in a month, it's exactly one calendar month since Barclays Bank, trading here as Third Energy, submitted their Frack plan and final application to Greg Clark, the Secretary of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which has replaced the old DEC. But funnily enough, he hasn't signed off on it, and as we've speculated over the last 4.5 weeks or so, he's desperately trying to dodge this political bullet. In fact, it's probably more a grenade or even a howitzer shell, because he will be very well aware that his political career hangs in the balance here. Although he may not get a instant reaction, his name will always be associated with whatever transpires if this well is fracked, and if the flow rates from this well inspire the other companies, particularly INEOS, to increase their campaign and their efforts to frack right across the north of England. Well, today I want to touch on the issue of water, because this is obviously a crucial element in the whole frack process. And I want to give you an example of how the industry will lie, deceive and obfuscate to be able to do what it wants to do, and then when it's got permission to do what it wants to do, it will modify the plan in the hope that people see it as, oh, it's just such a minor modification, then, you know, there's not going to be any real big deal and we can go ahead with it. Well, one of the issues that I and probably everybody else talking about this subject has flagged up over the past few years is the use of water. And the interesting thing is, of course, that the industry claims that you know, its usage of water is not particularly excessive, and that perhaps is a bit deceptive. I'm just going to put this muffler on because there is a bit of wind coming in, and it'll detract from what I'm saying. Let me just get this muffler on a second. There we go. Right. So one of the classic responses from the industry was by the Welshman Gerwyn Llewellyn-Williams, who's chief executive of UK Methane, and he has a raft of energy interests. He has interests in coal, in solar, in wind, and some unconventional gas licenses, primarily in the south of England and South Wales. The South Wales ones are now pretty much useless, but still got some interest in the south of England. Fortunately, the people of Kent ran him out of East Kent a few years ago, and the likelihood of anything ever kicking off in the old coal mining areas of East Kent is now very much slim to none. So well done to the people of Kent. But Gerwyn Llewellyn-Williams used to go to public meetings and say, you know, we often hear this question of water being raised, but, you know, it's very simple and it's not as bad as people think, because the amount of water we use for a single frack is no more than it takes to irrigate a field of wheat in a year, or to irrigate a golf course in a month. What he conveniently forgets is that when you irrigate something, the water remains within the cycle, because the water does one of three things. It irrigates, which is obviously why it's being poured on the ground, but if it's not irrigating the crops, it will percolate through into the ground, and what doesn't irrigate or percolate evaporates. So one way or another, it stays within the natural cycle, and the water is not lost to the system. The difference with water that is used in the frack process is once it is mixed with the toxic chemicals, once it is pumped into the ground, obviously, as we've discussed many times, more than half is lost. It goes into the geology, and thanks to Mr. Qualls, the technical director of Quadrilla, who openly stated at a public meeting a couple of years ago, when he was asked where this water goes in the geology, he said, well, actually, we have no idea. Well, thanks for that confirmation, because now the industry can't dodge that one. But the industry states that it is regarded as an excellent frack job if they get 50% back of what they've pumped down into the geology as flowback. And this flowback isn't just what they pump down, i.e. the water, the mixture of the chemicals that they've put in to create the frack fluid. It also contains the waste that is brought up from the geology. So it's the solids, i.e. that produced as a result of the fracture, but also any of the other gases or other naturally occurring radioactive materials, etc., that all come back to the surface. Now, Third Energy, in all its initial application, stated, well, you know, we're not going to use that much water, because what we're going to do is we're going to use the water in the first frack, which is about 276,000 gallons, and then we're going to salvage as much of that as we possibly can. We're going to treat it on site, and then we're going to use that for the next frack stages. Well, I'm sorry, but I'm going to use a technical term, because I and others stated right from the outset that that is complete bollocks. That isn't going to happen, because they need fresh water for the frack. And the reason they need fresh water is because if there are any impurities in the water, if there's anything in the water that adds to the friction, then they can't use it, because it's going to reduce the pressure that's created on the surface, so that by the time it gets to the bottom of the well, basically there's not going to be enough pressure there to frack. So the water has to be slick, and in fact that's another name for a frack fluid, for the total fluids that are pumped down. Slick water. Slick water. So the surfactants that are added, I mean, what's a surfactant? Well, Fairy Liquid, for example, is a surfactant. You know, it's the old test that we used to do in physics way back. I'm sure it probably isn't done now. But, you know, you put a needle on the top of a bowl of water and it will float, because there's a skin, a hard skin on the top of that water. But as soon as you pour a surfactant like Fairy Liquid into the water, then the needle immediately sinks, because that Fairy Liquid breaks up the water and it makes it softer. Less friction, so consequently more of the pressure gets to the bottom of the well. And if you're using, or think you're going to use, the produced water, the flowback water that comes back after you've done the frack, and treat it and then pump it down the well, no, you're not, because it just doesn't work. Well, it seems that my observation was actually vindicated, because it was brought to my attention. There was a letter that Third Energy wrote to the Environment Agency on the 9th of October of this year. And I just want to read this, because this is prima facie evidence of the fact that, in my opinion, they knew all along that they were not going to be able to reuse the frack fluid that they pumped down for the first well, and that they were going to have to dispose of that and then use fresh water for each of the other stages. So this is a letter to the Environment Agency. It's dated 9th of October this year, so almost exactly 2 months ago. So, dear whomever, this is in reference to the Third Energy UK Gas Limited waste management plan for Kirby Misperton well site. Third Energy Limited has recently submitted an amended waste management plan to the Environment Agency for approval. Amongst other things, the amended waste management plan seeks to remove the treatment of flowback water by electrocoagulation and its associated waste streams, as it no longer considered viable to treat the flowback water on site and reuse it in subsequent zones being stimulated. No shit. The purpose of this letter is to provide justification for removing the treatment of flowback water by electrocoagulation from the waste management plan. Third Energy fully understands its requirement under Article 4 of the revised EU Waste Framework Directive, which is transposed through UK law through the Waste England and Wales Regulations 2011, specifically the waste hierarchy, with the aim of reducing waste quantities. Whilst the environmental permit authorises both the treatment and non-treatment of flowback water, Third Energy has now taken the decision to remove the treatment of flowback water from its hydraulic fracturing stimulation operations. The decision is based on the following two influencing factors, which are explained in more detail below. 1. Uncertainty as to the rate of flowback, potentially leading to an increase in duration of operation. And 2. Only a small volume of the flowback water would be treated. The process of electrocoagulation treatment can only be considered if flowback water returns to surface at a suitable and sufficient rate. More bullshit, basically. Although the flow rate of the hydraulic fracture cannot be confirmed until the hydraulic fracture has taken place, Third Energy has taken the decision to remove any ambiguity over the timing of its operations by using fresh water for each hydraulic fracture stimulation. It is anticipated that approximately 30 to 50% of the hydraulic fracture fluid used in the operation will flow back to the surface. Notwithstanding the ambiguity associated with flowback rates, the overall volume of flowback water is not significant. Likewise, the number of HGV movements required to transfer the waste to an Environment Agency permitted wastewater treatment facility is not significant, having been assessed as part of the environmental impact assessment. Whilst the removal of flowback water treatment from the waste management plan represents a change in the hierarchy of waste, the permit application did maintain the option to either treat and reuse the flowback water or remove it from the site for subsequent off-site treatment at an Environment Agency permitted wastewater treatment facility. This letter simply confirms that Third Energy has been lying its arse. No, it doesn't. It says this letter simply confirms that Third Energy has taken the decision in advance to remove flowback water treatment from the waste management plan. Well, anyone who has really been following this industry and looking at the way they operate over the last decade or so will know that this is no real surprise, and it was pretty much a foregone conclusion that something like this would occur. So, Third Energy have now confirmed that they're not going to treat the wastewater on site. That was, in my opinion, never going to happen. And if you've looked at how congested the site is, basically there's nowhere to do that. There's nowhere to put any treatment facility. Can't get another vehicle really on that site. And that's another concern, of course, which is currently being addressed by the local community, because there is no evacuation plan. Although I did hear a rumour that Third Energy has said, actually, we have put an emergency plan in place. We're going to set up a telephone tree. Well, that's all fantastic, isn't it? A telephone tree to advise of a catastrophe or problems on the site to the local community less than half a mile away. Fantastic. Anyway, that may be another Achilles heel for Barclays Bank. So the water, let's come back to the water a second. So they said that the HGVs to transport the water is not significant. Well, if they get half back of what they've pumped down, that's basically going to be probably about 25, 30 HGV vehicles of waste. And it will be radioactive waste. Okay, it might be low level, but it will be most likely above the safe levels as determined by current legislation. So that's going to be transported. At the moment, we know not where. So could it be Brand Sands in Teesside, Greg Clark's home constituency, or sorry, place of birth, and maybe he thinks he's doing Teesside a favour by directing the waste to the Brand Sands facility, or is it going to go to Nostrop on the edge of Leeds? Well, either way, I would strongly advise the communities on Teesside, that sort of Redcar and round to Middlesbrough, to take a look at the issues that have occurred in the past where United Utilities treated Quadrilla's wastewater in 2011 and it was actually beyond their capabilities to do so. So they did the best job they could and then basically just pumped it into the Manchester Ship Canal and hope nobody noticed. So, you know, is the same thing going to go on here? Well, obviously there's going to be perhaps, hopefully, a bit more scrutiny. But let's come back to the usage of the water, because this is a test frack, and this is going to use 750,000. It's very, very low level in the wider scheme of things, but 750,000 gallons of water for a test frack. If they go into production, it's going to be in the region of 2 to 4 million gallons at least. In the US, the water that they use comes from the freshwater supplies from the Great Lakes, the Great Lakes in the on the US-Canadian border, the Great River System, the Mississippi, Missouri, Ohio rivers, or in the west from the aquifers. And these are aquifers that serve the communities there. And there are places in West Texas and in California that have not had water, or certainly not potable water, coming out of their taps for, in some cases, over 2 years. And there was a Texas community that took the industry to court because they knew that the unconventional oil and gas industry was sucking its water supply, but the courts ruled that the corporations had priority over the private citizen. So, and another issue up at the other end of the country in Pennsylvania, look at the situation of Dimmock. Dimmock in Pennsylvania, which lost its water supply, and then the politicians just before the election said, you know, yes, we're going to give you a 15-mile pipe, I think it was, linked into the public water supply so that, you know, we can address this issue. Well, that didn't happen. And so consequently, of course, what was Dimmock left with? The opportunity to pursue through the courts, knowing that they would probably lose, or just find alternative arrangements. In Australia, the water has been sucked out of the Great Artesian Basin at a rate 6 times greater than it can naturally replenish. And of course, traditionally and historically, the water has been used for irrigation purposes, and as we've said earlier, then the water stays within the system. So, where's the water coming from here? Well, that's a very good question. Of course, all the water authorities here are privatised. Many of them are foreign owned. And of course, they see this as just ka-ching, ka-ching. It's a wholesale opportunity. A wholesale opportunity for the sale of their product. So instead of relying on consumers who obviously only use what they need, and then trying to reduce their needs, because in many cases it's metered, and then an industry like this comes along and says, you know, we want 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million, 5 million gallons, and the water industry says, yes, we can help you. Regardless of the impact on the supplies, because whilst they have an idea of the resource, just like there are estimates of, you know, how much oil and gas is going to be extracted from a particular geological formation, it's an educated best guess. And of course, if it's contaminated, then, well, it's a whole different ballgame, isn't it? Now, you need to be aware that there is a global agenda to not only privatise water, because that's pretty much happened, but also for water to become an expensive commodity. Not that it already isn't. And, you know, Peter Brabeck, who was the former chairman and chief executive officer of Nestle, recorded an interview back in 2006, where he stated that in his opinion, water should not be regarded as a human right. Water is a commodity. So here, one of the fundamentals of life, and in Irish law, it was embedded in the law from time immemorial that water was a right to the people, which is why the people of Ireland rebelled and are still rebelling against the installation of water meters in their property. And the water companies have actually been going around the country in Ireland blocking off the natural springs where people in the rural communities would often get their drinking and cooking water, because it was pure, it was fresh. So, you know, this is the socio-psychopathic corporatist mentality, just to make money out of everything. Of course, we've seen the other extreme in places like Colombia, where a few years ago, the water company basically said, you know, we own everything, we own rainwater, and if you try and capture rainwater, we are going to come after you. And there were massive riots. And in Oregon, in the US a few years ago, a farmer was jailed for storing 30,000 gallons of rainwater in a pond on his property, which he built as a precaution against fire on the property, but he'd had the audacity to store rainwater, so the water utility came after him and ultimately he was jailed. This is the absurdity that's occurring elsewhere, and don't think for 1 minute that, you know, we can say, oh, well, it'll never happen here. How many times have we said that in the past, only for whatever it is we've been addressing to occur a few years down the road? So water in this country, we don't have Great Lakes, we don't have a great river system, we don't have a Great Artesian Basin. We have a hydrological network of aquifers, and the hydrologists in the country have a pretty good idea of the interconnectivity of those aquifers, but the hydrologists that I've spoken with over the last few years have all confirmed that we don't know in absolute detail how those aquifers are connected. So, you know, it may be that we contaminate the water in one area and then a few years later that contamination manifests some considerable distance away. And of course there's plausible deniability then, because no, that's 10, 15, 20 miles away from that frack site, so how can the frack site be related to this contamination? So, once again, you know, please don't take anything I'm telling you here at face value. That's not the purpose of what I'm trying to do. I'm simply trying to stimulate your own curiosity. And if I stimulate your curiosity, then hopefully you will enter into conversation with your friends, your colleagues, your family, with your local political representatives on the local council, county councils, and of course your MP, and make them aware. And we have to hold them to account, and this is something else that's being looked into right now, how to hold those individuals who make these decisions that ultimately lead to horrendous contamination, how they can be held personally to account. Of course, in the corporate world, people try and hide behind the corporate logo, and that's very, very convenient. So, you know, you don't see the CEO versus whomever, or the managing director versus whomever. It's always the corporation. This is Admiralty law. That's a subject for another day. So we have to find the way, meaningful way, to hold all of these individuals to account. So the chief executives of Barclays Bank, of the funds that are behind this operation here, of the politicians like Greg Clark, of the people in the Environment Agency, the HSE, don't let them be nameless, because these are the people who are on the front line, and the decisions they make in the coming days, weeks or months will determine the viability of this country for future generations. As I said yesterday, you know, food security is a massive issue. We're only producing 50% of the food that we consume in the UK in this country. The rest is being imported from overseas. So if there is an issue, it's not energy security, it's food security, and we are potentially on the cusp of destroying an enormous amount of acreage of prime agricultural farmland if Greg Clark and the others pushing for this industry to become established get their way. So please share this around. And as I've said many times, you know, don't let this be an echo chamber. It's one of the big problems of social media, that, you know, we're always just speaking to the converted, preaching to the choir, as it were. So, you know, our challenge is to find ways to break out into other activist communities. And I know, you know, people, particularly people who live in the cities, are very time poor. You know, they're either working almost 24/7 or, you know, catering for the family, whatever. So, you know, I'm appealing to those people who do have the luxury still of some spare time. And please invest that spare time in looking at this abomination of unconventional gas exploitation, because when you spend even an hour looking at the devastation that this industry has caused elsewhere, you will realize why it is that many of us have literally put everything on hold to try and ensure that this industry does not become established in this densely populated island of ours. So 1 month after Barclays Bank, trading as Third Energy, submit their application, it's still not signed off. There are rumours floating around that Greg Clark may sign it off next week. Well, that's going to be one hell of a Christmas present for other people here in Kirby Misperton. So my bet is that he's going to hold off until the new year. So that's time for people to spread the word, for people to do their research. And then when Greg Clark, assuming he does, do what we hope he doesn't, and sign this off, then people can come from all over the country and witness this abomination going down firsthand. And that may be the turning point in their life. Hopefully, they will realise that they have to put some time and energy into shutting this down. So thanks for joining me through the week, and I will be back on Monday morning at 8:30 with a live stream update. Meanwhile, have a great weekend, and as I say, if you have any spare time, just spend half an hour just taking a look at fracking and water contamination, and you will see why it is that we have a potential problem in this country, a problem that may be the legacy that is literally the undoing of this country as a standalone sovereign nation. So thanks a lot.